I welcome you to my channel. Subscribe and listen to my new stories every day. The day began like any other in our quiet suburban life. The scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the kitchen, mingling with the cheerful clatter of breakfast plates. Diane, my wife of 15 years, bustled about, recounting some anecdote about a client meeting. Her laughter filled the room, and for a fleeting moment, everything seemed perfect. Yet, beneath the surface, an unsettling dissonance lingered. For years, Diane had worked as a pharmaceutical representative, a job that took her on frequent trips across the country. She was good at what she did, charming and persuasive, qualities that had drawn me to her in the first place. But as her trips became more frequent and her stories more elaborate, cracks began to appear in the facade of our marriage. It started innocuously enough. One afternoon, while organizing the garage, I stumbled upon an old suitcase of Diane's. It was buried under a pile of forgotten mementos, a relic of trips we'd never taken together. Curious, I opened it, expecting to find clothes or perhaps keepsakes from her childhood. Instead, I found a collection of souvenirs, keychains, postcards, and little trinkets from places Diane had never mentioned visiting. Orlando. A place I had no memory of her ever traveling to for work. My heart raced as I fingered a postcard featuring a bright, sunlit skyline. The back bore a brief, impersonal note, "Thinking of you." It was signed only with the letter J. I set the postcard down and took a deep breath. Perhaps I was overreacting. Diane had always been thoughtful, the type to pick up small gifts for her friends or colleagues. Maybe these items had nothing to do with her work, or with me. But doubts, once planted, are hard to uproot. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the unease. Every glance at Diane's cheerful smile felt tainted. Every story she told about her work trips seemed rehearsed. The ease with which she navigated her double life was chilling. One evening, while Diane prepared for another of her many conferences, I sat in the kitchen, watching her pack. She was meticulous, folding each item of clothing with care. I asked her casually about the itinerary, the clients she'd be meeting, the cities she'd visit. She answered smoothly, her tone light, but her words felt hollow. I wanted to believe her. God, how I wanted to believe her. But something was off. That night, after Diane left for the airport, I found myself unable to sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation, every strange detail I'd overlooked. Finally, I got up, poured myself a stiff drink, and opened my laptop. Diane had always been terrible with passwords. She used the same one for everything, our bank accounts, her email, even our streaming services. It was almost laughably easy to access her inbox. My hands trembled as I clicked through the emails, each one more damning than the last. The correspondence with someone named Jeremy began innocuously enough. They exchanged professional updates, joked about industry trends, and discussed mundane work matters. But as I scrolled further, the tone shifted. Their words grew intimate, their jokes more personal. There were mentions of shared dinners, late-night walks, and stolen moments. My stomach churned as I read an email dated just a month ago. Jeremy. Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about it. I wish we didn't have to wait so long to see each other again. Next month in Orlando. Let me know. Always. Diane. My world tilted on its axis. The days that followed were a blur of shock and disbelief. I went through the motions at work, barely able to concentrate. At home, I avoided Diane as much as possible. Each kiss, each touch, felt like a betrayal, a cruel reminder of the lies she was weaving. But I didn't confront her. Not yet. I needed more than emails. I needed proof she couldn't deny. I began piecing together her travel history, cross-referencing it with her credit card statements and work expense reports. It was a painstaking process, but each detail painted a clearer picture of her duplicity. There were charges for restaurants in cities she'd never mentioned visiting. Hotel stays that didn't align with her supposed conference dates. Flights booked to Orlando, always Orlando. My worst suspicions were confirmed when I found messages between Diane and our 19-year-old stepdaughter, Sonia. In them, Diane coached Sonia on what to tell me if I asked questions about her trips. The betrayal cut even deeper, knowing Sonia had been complicit. I felt like a stranger in my own home. One evening, as Diane packed for yet another trip, she hummed softly to herself, oblivious to my inner turmoil. She kissed me goodbye, her lips brushing my cheek as she promised to call once she landed. I watched her leave, my heart a maelstrom of anger and heartbreak. But I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. Diane had built her house of cards carefully, and I intended to dismantle it just as methodically. I reached for the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years, our family lawyer. "Stephen," came the familiar voice. "What can I do for you?" I hesitated for a moment, then said, "I need to review my prenup." Diane had drafted the agreement herself, back when she was a practicing attorney. I'd barely skimmed it at the time, trusting her implicitly. But now, as I sat in the lawyer's office, I pored over every line with new eyes. There it was, buried in the fine print, a clause about fidelity. A breach would nullify her claims to our joint assets. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sliver of control. When Diane returned from her trip, I was waiting. She greeted me with her usual warmth, telling me about the conference and the clients she'd met. I listened silently, my expression unreadable. "Stephen," she said, concern flickering across her face. "Is something wrong?" I smiled faintly. "Not at all. I've just been thinking about us." Her relief was almost palpable. She kissed me and promised we'd talk more over dinner. But I had no intention of talking. Not until the time was right. The dinner table was set with Diane's favorite pasta dish, a bottle of wine breathing on the counter. She came home from work that evening humming a cheerful tune, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in our seemingly idyllic life. She kissed me on the cheek, ruffled my hair, and commented on how thoughtful it was that I'd cooked dinner. It was all so normal. Too normal. As we sat down to eat, I watched her closely. Every smile, every laugh, every casual comment felt like a dagger. I could see the facade she had perfected, and it filled me with a strange mix of sorrow and rage. For 15 years, I had loved this woman, trusted her, built a life with her. And now, all I could see were the cracks in the foundation. "How was work?" I asked, twirling my fork in the pasta. "Busy as always," she replied, her voice light. "You know how it is with end-of-quarter reports. Everyone's scrambling to meet deadlines." I nodded, biting back the urge to confront her right then and there. Instead, I asked, "And your next trip? Do you have the dates locked in yet?" Diane's fork froze mid-air for the briefest moment before she recovered. "Not yet. There's talk of a conference in Chicago, but nothing's confirmed." A lie. I knew her next trip was to Orlando. I had seen the email confirming her flight. "Oh, Chicago," I said, feigning interest. "Maybe I'll come along. It's been a while since we've had a weekend away together." Her smile faltered, just for a second. "That sounds lovely, Stephen, but it's going to be all business. Long days, boring meetings. You'd hate it." "I don't mind," I replied smoothly. "I'd love to see you in action, Diane. It's inspiring how much you care about your work." She gave a nervous laugh and changed the subject, steering the conversation to safer territory. I let her, but my mind was racing. Every lie she told was another nail in the coffin of our marriage. After dinner, Diane excused herself to take a shower. I listened to the sound of the water running upstairs, my thoughts a whirlwind. It was time to escalate my plan. The lawyer had armed me with what I needed, but gathering more evidence would ensure there was no way for Diane to wriggle out of this. I had already combed through her emails, credit card statements, and travel records. The next step was her phone. Diane was careful, but no one was perfect. If there were messages or photos she hadn't deleted, they could be the final piece of the puzzle. When the water shut off, I moved quickly. Diane's phone was charging on the kitchen counter. I unplugged it and unlocked it using her fingerprint, something she had insisted on setting up for convenience years ago. My heart raced as I opened her messaging app, scrolling through the conversations. Most were mundane, chats with colleagues, family, and friends. But then I found a thread with no name, just a phone number. The messages were casual at first, discussing work topics, but the tone shifted as I scrolled further. Jay, can't wait to see you again. Orlando next week. Diane, of course. Counting down the days. The pit in my stomach deepened as I read through the exchanges. The messages were littered with intimate details and plans they'd made together. There were even photos, selfies of Diane and Jeremy at what appeared to be a lakeside resort, their smiles bright, their eyes alight with something that was no longer present in our marriage. I copied everything onto a USB drive, my hands trembling as I worked. By the time Diane came downstairs, her phone was back on the counter, and I was sitting on the couch with a book in hand. "Everything okay?" she asked, wrapping a towel around her damp hair. "Of course," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just catching up on some reading." In the following days, I took my plan a step further. I installed a small tracking device in Diane's car and a monitoring app on her phone. It felt invasive, wrong even, but the stakes were too high for hesitation. If I was going to confront her, I needed irrefutable evidence. The tracking device showed me exactly where she went during her work trips. Unsurprisingly, her destinations rarely aligned with her claims. Orlando came up again and again, sometimes for days at a time. The monitoring app provided even more damning proof, calls, messages, even location data that placed her at Jeremy's house during those trips. Each discovery chipped away at the remnants of the love I once felt for her. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the deception, the audacity to weave her lies into the fabric of our lives. One evening, as Diane packed for another trip, I decided to test her. She was in the bedroom, folding clothes into her suitcase, when I leaned against the doorframe and asked, "Do you ever get lonely on these trips?" She looked up, startled by the question. "Lonely? No, not really. There's always so much to do, so many people to meet." "I was just thinking," I continued, my tone casual, "it must be hard, being away from home so often. I miss you when you're gone." Her eyes softened, and for a moment, I almost believed the affection in her gaze was real. "I miss you too, Stephen. But you know how it is. It's just part of the job." I nodded, forcing a smile. "I understand. But I didn't. Not anymore." The night before her trip, I went over my plan one last time. Diane was asleep beside me, her breathing steady and peaceful. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing with everything I had discovered. The evidence was airtight, the prenup on my side. All that remained was the confrontation. I had spent weeks gathering the pieces, and now it was time to lay them all out. Diane had built her web of lies, and tomorrow, I would unravel it. As I lay there in the darkness, a strange sense of calm washed over me. The anger and heartbreak were still there, but beneath them was something else, a quiet resolve. Diane had taken our life, our marriage, and twisted it into something unrecognizable. Now, I would take it back. Tomorrow, the truth would come to light. And Diane would face the consequences of her choices. Morning broke with an eerie sense of normalcy. Diane hummed softly to herself as she moved about the kitchen, packing a small lunch for her flight. Her suitcase was by the door, her polished appearance a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing beneath the surface. Today was the day I would lay everything bare. I sipped my coffee, watching her through the steam rising from the cup. "What time is your flight?" I asked casually. 11, she replied, glancing at the clock. "I should leave soon to beat traffic." I nodded, setting my cup down. "Before you go, Diane, we need to talk." Her hands froze mid-motion, the cheerful hum fading into silence. She turned to face me, her brow furrowed. "What about?" "Sit down," I said, gesturing to the kitchen table. Her hesitation was brief, but telling. She took a seat, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "You're scaring me, Stephen. What's going on?" I sat across from her, pulling a manila folder from beneath my chair and placing it on the table. "I know about Orlando," I said, my voice calm but firm. The color drained from her face. "What are you talking about?" "Jeremy. The trips. The lies." I opened the folder, spreading out the evidence I had collected: emails, messages, credit card statements, GPS data. "It's all here, Diane." For a moment, she just stared, her eyes darting between the damning documents. Then she laughed, a brittle, defensive sound. "You've been spying on me." "That's insane, Stephen." "What's insane," I countered, "is the lengths you've gone to deceive me. Our marriage, our home, everything we've built, it's all a lie." Her face hardened, the laughter dying on her lips. "I don't know what you think you've found, but it's not what it looks like." "Don't insult me," I snapped, my composure slipping. "I have the proof, Diane. I know about Jeremy. I know about the weekends you've spent with him. I know you've involved Sonia in covering for you. Do you have any idea what that's done to me?" Her defiance wavered, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of remorse. But then her chin lifted, her expression hardening once more. "You don't understand, Stephen. It wasn't just about him. It was about me. I felt suffocated. Trapped. I needed something for myself." "Something for yourself?" I repeated, incredulous. "And what about us? What about me? Did you even think about what this would do to our family?" Tears welled in her eyes, but I couldn't tell if they were born of guilt or self-pity. "I never meant to hurt you," she whispered. "I love you, Stephen. I do." "Love?" I said bitterly. "Don't use that word. Not after everything you've done." The silence that followed was deafening. Diane wiped her eyes, her hands trembling. "What happens now?" she asked finally. I reached into the folder and pulled out the prenuptial agreement. "This happens," I said, sliding it across the table. "You remember this, don't you? The document you insisted we sign before we got married?" Her eyes widened as she scanned the papers, the weight of the fidelity clause sinking in. "Stephen, you can't be serious." "I'm dead serious," I replied. "You breached our agreement, Diane. That means you forfeit any claim to our joint assets. The house, the cars, the savings, they're mine." Her composure shattered. "You can't do this to me. Where am I supposed to go? What am I supposed to do?" "That's not my problem," I said coldly. "You made your choice, Diane. Now you have to live with the consequences." She pleaded, begged, even tried to bargain. But I was resolute. The years of betrayal, the lies, the manipulation, they had eroded any sympathy I might have felt for her. Diane had torn our life apart, and now she would face the fallout. By the time she left for her flight, she was a shadow of the confident, composed woman I had married. I watched her go, a strange mix of relief and sorrow washing over me. The confrontation was over, but the wounds it had left would take time to heal. That evening, I sat alone in the house that now felt both empty and suffocating. The silence was deafening, a stark contrast to the chaos of the day. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had happened. The anger, the heartbreak, the betrayal, they all came crashing down. But beneath the pain was a quiet sense of closure. Diane's lies had been exposed, and I had taken back control of my life. It wasn't the ending I had envisioned when we stood at the altar 15 years ago, but it was an ending nonetheless. And for that, I was grateful. The days following Diane's departure were eerily calm. The house felt unnaturally quiet without her presence, but it was a peace I welcomed. I spent my time finalizing the divorce proceedings, meeting with my lawyer, and preparing for the next chapter of my life. There was an odd sense of liberation in reclaiming my space, my thoughts, and my dignity. But the calm didn't last. 2 weeks after our confrontation, I received a letter in the mail. The envelope bore no return address, and the handwriting was unfamiliar. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. I unfolded it, my heart sinking as I read the words. Stephen. You think you know the whole story, but you don't. Diane wasn't the only one keeping secrets. You should check the accounts. All of them. Trust me. There was no signature, no indication of who had sent it. My first thought was that it was a cruel joke, perhaps Diane's way of sowing more chaos in my life. But something about the letter felt off. The wording was too precise, the tone too measured. It wasn't her style. Curiosity gnawed at me, and I decided to investigate. I began with our joint bank accounts, scrolling through transactions and statements. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Bills, groceries, the occasional dinner out, it all aligned with our usual spending patterns. Frustrated but intrigued, I expanded my search, delving into investment accounts, retirement funds, and even Diane's personal savings. And that's when I found it. A hidden account in Diane's name, one I had never known existed. It was listed under an offshore bank, with transfers dating back nearly a decade. The balance was staggering, hundreds of thousands of dollars siphoned from our joint assets over the years. The dates of the withdrawals lined up suspiciously with Diane's work trips. My blood ran cold as the truth began to take shape. This wasn't just infidelity. This was calculated, premeditated betrayal. Diane had been planning her exit for years, building a safety net while I remained oblivious. But the most shocking revelation came when I dug deeper into the account's transaction history. Among the payments were several large transfers to an individual named Sonia Harrison. Sonia. Diane's daughter. My stepdaughter. The realization hit me like a freight train. Sonia hadn't just been complicit in Diane's affair, she had been a key player. The money, the cover-ups, the lies, it had all been orchestrated with her involvement. The sweet, innocent girl I had helped raise was no victim. She was part of the conspiracy. Rage and betrayal surged within me, but there was no time to dwell on it. I needed answers. I confronted Sonia the next day. She was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, when I stormed into the room. "We need to talk," I said, my voice low and steady. She looked up, startled by my tone. "What's wrong?" "I found the account," I said. "The one your mother set up. The one she's been funneling money into. And I know about the transfers to you." Her face paled, her phone slipping from her hands. I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me, Sonia," I snapped. "Not after everything I've done for you. For this family. I deserve the truth." For a moment, she looked as though she might deny it again. But then her shoulders sagged, and she let out a shaky breath. "It wasn't my idea," she said. "Mom, she convinced me it was for our future. She said you'd never notice, that it didn't matter because you'd still have plenty. I didn't want to, but..." "But you did," I interrupted. "You helped her steal from me. You lied to me. You betrayed me." Tears filled her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. Not anymore. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't think it would go this far. The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal action. I froze the offshore account, contacted my lawyer, and began the arduous process of reclaiming what was rightfully mine. Diane, predictably, tried to fight back, but her position was weak. The prenup, combined with the evidence of her financial misdeeds, left her with little leverage. But the surprises weren't over. One evening, as I sorted through more documents, I found another letter, this one tucked inside an old file Diane had left behind. It was addressed to me, written in Diane's unmistakable handwriting. The date on the letter was from 3 years ago. Stephen. If you're reading this, it means everything has fallen apart. I don't know how else to explain myself, so I'll just tell you the truth. Jeremy isn't just someone I met at a conference. He's someone from my past. Someone I loved before I met you. I didn't plan for this to happen, but when I saw him again, all those feelings came rushing back. I thought I could handle it, but I was wrong. I know you'll never forgive me for what I've done. I wouldn't forgive me either. But please know this, I never stopped loving you. Not even for a moment. I stared at the letter, my emotions a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and disbelief. Diane's words felt hollow, a feeble attempt to justify the unforgivable. But beneath them, I sensed a kernel of truth, a final admission of the love that had once bound us. In the end, I got everything Diane had tried to take from me, the house, the money, even custody of the memories we had built together. But victory felt hollow. The damage she had done couldn't be undone, and the scars would remain. As I stood in the empty house, staring out the window at the life we had built, I realized something profound. Revenge might bring closure, but it doesn't bring peace. And in the quiet aftermath of it all, I found myself longing not for vengeance, but for something much harder to find. Forgiveness.